Two little twins shouldn't have been that deep in the canyons of Monument Valley, but their dog Rusty had other plans. What they were about to find would change not just their lives, but the fate of everyone they knew. 8-year-old Boone scrambled over a sun-baked rock, his brother Clayton right behind him. The Utah sun was relentless, turning the red dust into a fine powder that coated everything. They were chasing the sound of a frantic bark, a sound that was leading them further and further from the familiar trails around their small homestead. Rusty had shot into a narrow crack between two towering sandstone buttes, a place they'd never noticed before. The entrance was almost invisible, hidden behind a stack of loose rocks that looked almost deliberate, like someone had put them there on purpose. A cold feeling trickled down Clayton's spine, but the thought of leaving their dog was worse. They squeezed through the opening, and the blazing sun was gone, replaced by a sudden, chilling dark. The air was stale, thick with the smell of dust and something else, something old. As their eyes adjusted, they saw it wasn't a natural cave. The walls were too smooth in places, and the floor was mostly flat. Someone had used this place. And then Boone saw it. Tucked into a recess in the rock wall was an old leather satchel, covered in a thick layer of dust. It looked like it had been sitting there forgotten for 100 years. Boone reached for it, his hands trembling slightly. Clayton found something else nearby, stacks of papers wrapped carefully in oilcloth, looking strangely preserved in the dry cave air. He unwrapped the first bundle. The documents looked official, stamped with seals, and covered in elegant, fading signatures from decades past. "These are land deeds," Clayton whispered, his voice barely a sound in the heavy silence. He squinted at the faded ink. "But they're for places I don't recognize. The names are all wrong." Boone, meanwhile, had unlatched the satchel. Inside were more papers, but also maps, detailed maps carved into treated leather. He unrolled one, and his breath caught in his throat. It showed their valley, their community, but it was filled with marks and symbols they'd never seen before. Markings for hidden water sources, veins of silver and copper, locations that could turn their struggling settlement into a boomtown overnight. This was more than a forgotten hideout. This was a treasure trove of secrets. "Look at this," Clayton said, his voice sharp. He pointed to a newer stack of papers, these ones with fresh pencil marks. Someone had been here recently. Someone was updating these documents, adding notes, tracking changes. And as they read, an incredible, terrible picture began to form. Their small, struggling community wasn't struggling by accident. It was sitting on a fortune in resources, resources that a few powerful people were secretly claiming for themselves, resources that were supposed to belong to everyone. And that's when they heard the voices. They weren't echoes from outside. They were coming from deeper inside the cave, from a tunnel they hadn't even seen. Adult voices, low and serious, discussing plans to move families off their land. Families who had no idea what they were giving up. Someone was coming. The people who used this cave for their secret meetings were on their way back. And they had no idea that two curious little boys had just stumbled upon everything they'd tried so hard to hide. The voices grew louder. Boone and Clayton flattened themselves against the cold stone wall, trying to disappear into the shadows. Three men were walking through the deeper tunnels, their footsteps echoing off the rock. The boys could make out the words now, and what they heard made their blood run cold. They were talking about water rights, mineral claims, and families. "The Patterson family won't know what hit them," one voice said, followed by a cruel, humorless laugh. "By the time they realize their new deed is worthless, we'll own half the valley." Clayton's heart hammered against his ribs. He recognized that voice. It belonged to Eli Thompson, the lawyer who handled all the community's legal affairs. The man his own mother trusted completely. The same man who had convinced several families to sell their land for pennies on the dollar, telling them the soil was too poor to farm and that they'd be better off in town. Boone clutched the leather satchel to his chest. His small fingers traced the official seals on the old deeds they'd found. These papers told a very different story. The land wasn't poor. It was rich beyond imagination. It was flowing with underground water and laced with valuable minerals. It was a secret Eli and his partners were killing to protect. "What about the Whitmore woman?" another voice asked, and the boys froze. They were talking about their mother, Mercy. She's been asking too many questions about her husband's original claim, the voice continued. Their father had died 2 years ago in what everyone called a tragic ranching accident. He'd left behind a plot of land their mother fought tooth and nail to keep. Eli had been visiting often, pressuring her to sell, telling her it was too much for a widow with 2 young boys to handle. Don't worry about Mercy, Eli's voice was smooth, but laced with a threat that was sharper than any knife. She'll come around, especially when she realizes how dangerous it can be for a woman all alone out here. Accidents happen all the time. The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Their father's death. It might not have been an accident at all. Clayton's hands were shaking so hard he could barely roll up one of the maps. This map, the one showing their own family's land, had a massive blue circle drawn right under their house. It depicted one of the largest underground springs in the entire region. Their mother was sitting on a literal gold mine, and these men were planning to steal it, one way or another. The footsteps were closer now. A flicker of lamplight danced on the tunnel walls. In a few seconds, the men would round the corner and find them. They'd be discovered with the very evidence that could put these powerful men in prison for life, or get their entire family killed. We have to go, Boone whispered, his voice trembling. He tugged on his brother's shirt, but as they turned to scramble for the cave entrance, their hearts stopped. Their only escape route was gone. A fourth man was standing there, a tall silhouette against the bright daylight, blocking their only way out. He was just standing there, waiting. The trap hadn't just been sprung. It had been set for them long before they ever set foot in this cave. The man at the entrance wasn't anyone they knew. He was tall and weathered, with a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in deep shadow. He stood perfectly still, like a statue carved from the canyon rock, and for a terrifying moment, the boys thought he was one of them. But he didn't call out. He didn't raise an alarm. Instead, he slowly lifted one finger to his lips. Shh. Then he motioned with his head, a quick, urgent gesture toward a narrow ledge they hadn't seen before, a sliver of rock running along the canyon wall. This way, he whispered, his voice a low rumble. Stay low. Move quiet as mice. Boone hesitated, clutching the satchel of documents. Every instinct screamed at him not to trust a stranger, not now. But the sound of Eli Thompson's voice, now angry and confused from inside the cave, left them no other choice. Clayton grabbed his brother's arm and pulled him toward the ledge, toward their only chance. The stranger led them along a treacherous path that hugged the cliffside, 50 feet above the valley floor. One wrong step, one loose rock, and it was all over. Behind them, angry shouts erupted from the cave. The papers! Where are the papers? Eli's voice echoed across the canyon, raw with fury. Someone was in there. Find them. The stranger didn't slow down. He moved with a quiet confidence that was both reassuring and terrifying. When they finally reached a wider section of the ledge, a small alcove hidden by a juniper tree, he finally spoke again in hushed tones. Name's Silas Ward, he said, turning to face them. I've been tracking those snakes for months, waiting for the right moment. He glanced at the satchel in Boone's arms, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Looks like you boys just handed me the proof I needed. Clayton stared at the man, his mind racing. How do we know you're not one of them? For an answer, Silas reached into his vest and pulled out a small, tarnished piece of metal. He polished it on his sleeve and held it out. It was a badge, a federal marshal's star that glinted in the afternoon sun. Because I've been investigating land fraud across 3 territories, Silas said, his voice hard as iron. And Eli Thompson's name is at the center of all of it. He's robbed dozens of families, but he's clever. He never leaves evidence behind. He looked down at the satchel again. Until now. The sound of horses whinnying from the valley floor below cut him short. Eli and his men were organizing a search party. It wouldn't take them long to find their trail. Time was running out. Your mother's in danger, Silas said, his expression turning grim. Once Eli realizes what you found, he'll do whatever it takes to silence your family for good. We need to get these papers to the territorial courthouse before he can get to you. Boone looked at the marshal, then at his brother. They were just 8 years old, caught in the middle of something huge and deadly. They held the key to saving not just their mother, but dozens of families who had been cheated and lied to. But could they trust this stranger with their lives? And could they possibly outrun the most powerful man in the valley before he hunted them down? A rifle shot cracked through the canyon, the bullet whining off the rock just inches above their heads. Eli's men weren't just searching anymore. They were shooting at shadows, desperate to eliminate anyone who knew their secret. Silas didn't flinch. He just pushed the boys lower against the rock and pointed toward a series of game trails winding up the side of the mesa. He moved with a practiced speed, guiding them through passages that only a man who lived in the wild would know. "We need to get to your mother before they do," Silas said, pausing for a moment to scan the valley below. "Once they realize you have those documents, she becomes their biggest liability." Boone clutched the leather satchel so tightly his knuckles were white. His legs ached from the climb, but the fear was a fire in his veins, pushing him forward. These papers weren't just papers anymore. They were the truth. They were proof that good, honest families had been systematically robbed by a man they trusted. "There," Clayton panted, pointing a shaky finger. In the distance, they could see their small homestead, a tiny curl of smoke rising from the chimney. Their mother was home, but as they watched, their relief curdled into pure terror. 3 riders were approaching the house, not on the main road, but from 3 different directions, cutting off any chance of escape. The boys recognized Eli Thompson's big black horse instantly, along with 2 of his most ruthless hired guns. They were surrounding the property. They were trapping their mother. Silas cursed under his breath. "They're moving faster than I thought. We need a new plan." The thin mountain air carried the sound of shouting. It was their mother's voice, Mercy Whitmore, clear and strong, demanding to know what business they had on her land. But even from so far away, the boys could hear the tremor of fear beneath her brave words. She was alone. She had no idea what kind of monster she was facing. "She doesn't know," Boone whispered, his voice breaking. "She doesn't know what they're capable of." The federal marshal studied the terrain, his eyes narrowed, calculating angles and distances like a master chess player. "There's a back trail. It leads to the old abandoned mine shaft behind your house. If we can get there unseen, we might be able to warn her, get her out." But even as he spoke, more riders appeared on the horizon, a dozen or more. Word had spread through Eli's network. Reinforcements were arriving, not just to secure some papers, but to make sure there were no witnesses left to talk. Then Clayton saw something that made his blood run cold. "Look," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Look at their hands." Each of the new riders carried a torch, a lit torch, burning brightly in the middle of the afternoon. The message was unmistakable. If they couldn't scare Mercy Whitmore into signing away her land, they were going to burn the house to the ground, with her inside. "We're too late," Silas said grimly, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip. "They're not planning on leaving any witnesses alive." The boys watched in horror as Eli Thompson swung down from his horse near their front door. He held a legal document in one hand and the burning torch in the other. He was about to give their mother one last choice: sign away her fortune or die in the flames. Time had just run out. Mercy Whitmore didn't flinch. She stood in her doorway, the family's old rifle held steady, its barrel aimed right at Eli Thompson's chest. The corrupt lawyer held up the forged deed with a smug smile, the torch in his other hand casting flickering, demonic shadows on his face. He was confident. He had the numbers. This was just a formality. "Be reasonable, Mercy," Eli said, his voice dripping with false kindness. "Just sign the paper. We can all walk away from this without any unpleasantness." "My husband died for this land," she replied, her voice as steady and hard as the canyon rock. "I will not dishonor his memory by handing it over to a thief and a coward." From their hiding spot near the old mine shaft, Silas and the boys watched the scene unfold. They were too far away to help, close enough to see everything. "Your mother's braver than any 10 men I know," Silas whispered, a note of grudging admiration in his voice. "But courage doesn't stop a bullet." Eli's patience snapped. He gestured to his men, who began to spread out, tightening the circle around the small house. "You have 10 seconds to sign that document, Mercy," he shouted. "After that, I can't guarantee your safety, or the safety of those precious boys of yours." wherever they've run off to. Clayton grabbed his brother's arm, his nails digging in. He knows. He knows we're alive. The horrifying realization hit them like a punch to the gut. Eli wasn't just trying to steal their land anymore. He was using their mother as bait. He was trying to draw them out of hiding because he knew they had the evidence. He had to eliminate the only witnesses who could connect him to his crimes. She won't sign, Boone said, his voice filled with a terrible certainty. She'd rather die. Which means we need to act fast, Silas nodded grimly. Those documents you're holding are worthless if we're all dead. He checked the cylinder of his pistol, his eyes darting around, assessing the situation. I can create a distraction, a big one. It'll be your only chance to get to your mother and convince her to run. But as they prepared to move, a new group of riders appeared on the Eastern Trail. Clayton's heart leaped. He recognized the man in the lead. It was Sheriff Morrison, a man who had always seemed fair, a man who had known their father for years. The sheriff, Boone breathed, a wave of relief washing over him. He'll stop them. Don't move, Silas hissed, grabbing both boys and pulling them down. Look closer. Look where they're riding. The terrible truth dawned as Sheriff Morrison rode not to the house to intervene, but directly to Eli Thompson. The two men spoke quietly, gesturing at the house, at the surrounding men. The lawman wasn't here to stop the attack. He was helping to coordinate it. Their mother was surrounded. The conspiracy didn't just run deep, it ran the whole town. Every branch of authority, every person they might have turned to for help, was on Eli Thompson's payroll. There was nowhere to run. There was no one to trust. Their situation hadn't just gotten worse. It had just become impossible. Silas scanned the positions of Eli's men, his gaze sharp and calculating. The corrupt lawyer had made a single, critical mistake. He was so confident, so sure of his power, that he hadn't bothered to post guards on the high ground behind the house. He didn't expect an attack from above. Listen to me, the federal marshal whispered, his voice low and intense. There's an old mine shaft up here. It connects to your root cellar. I'm going to create enough confusion to draw their fire. When I do, you run for that shaft. You get to your mother through that tunnel. You understand? Clayton shook his head. That tunnel's blocked. Father sealed it years ago after a cave-in. Cave-ins can be cleared, Silas replied, his face a grim mask, especially when lives are on the line. Below them, the standoff was reaching its breaking point. Mercy's arms had to be aching, but she held the rifle steady. Eli Thompson was done playing games. Time's up, Mercy, he bellowed. Last chance. Then you'll have to take it from me, she yelled back, her defiance echoing across the valley. Eli nodded to Sheriff Morrison. The corrupt lawman slowly raised his own pistol. The pretense of law and order was over. This was about to become a cold-blooded murder, disguised as resisting arrest. Silas took off his federal marshal badge and pressed it into Boone's hand. If something happens to me, he said, his eyes locking with the boys, this might convince an honest judge somewhere to look at your evidence. But right now we move. With that, the marshal began to slink down the rocky slope, using every boulder and scrub brush for cover. His plan was suicidal, but it was their only chance. Create enough chaos for the boys to slip through the cracks. As Silas disappeared from view, Clayton's eyes caught something else. Something that changed everything all over again. Leading away from the back of their property, heading toward the network of abandoned mines were fresh tracks. Not from a horse, from a wagon. Heavy wagons, loaded down with something substantial. His eyes followed the tracks as they connected to a web of old mining trails that crisscrossed the valley. And suddenly the full scope of Eli's criminal empire slammed into him. He wasn't just stealing land. He was using the abandoned mines as a secret highway, a smuggling route to move stolen goods and contraband throughout the territory, hidden from everyone. Their remote homestead wasn't just on valuable land. It was sitting directly on top of his entire operation. He's not just here for the water, Clayton realized aloud, his voice filled with a new kind of horror. We found his whole operation. As if in answer, men began to rise from concealed positions all over the valley. Not a dozen, dozens. Armed to the teeth, emerging from gullies and behind rock formations. This was never about one woman and her farm. This was about protecting a criminal conspiracy worth millions. This was about eliminating the only people who had stumbled upon the truth. The first gunshot shattered the silence. It came from Silas's position. One of Eli's men crumpled to the ground. The distraction had begun. Chaos erupted. Men scrambled for cover, firing wildly in the direction of the shot. It was the opening the boys needed. They sprinted for the mine entrance, their small forms hidden by the tall grass. Behind them, they heard their mother's rifle join the fight, her shots sharp and precise. They reached the abandoned mine shaft and squeezed through a gap in the collapsed timbers, plunging into the darkness. They were in a narrow passage that they knew led directly beneath their house. But what they found inside made their blood freeze. The tunnel wasn't abandoned. It was a warehouse. Crates of stolen rifles, expensive fabrics, and mining equipment lined the walls, all marked with shipping labels from cities hundreds of miles away. They had been living on top of a criminal headquarters for years without ever knowing. "He was using our cellar," Boone whispered, his eyes wide with disbelief. Then they heard voices from above, heavy boots stomping on the floorboards of their own home. Men were inside, searching every room. They were tearing the place apart, looking for the very documents the boys were clutching. They pressed forward toward the faint light filtering down from the root cellar trapdoor. They had to warn their mother. But a terrible new thought struck them. If Eli's men found this tunnel, there would be no safe place left in the entire territory. As they got closer, Clayton saw fresh scratches on the wooden trapdoor. Someone had been using this entrance recently. Their home had been violated long before today. "Mother!" Boone called softly, his voice muffled by the floorboards. "Mother! It's us! Come down here!" Footsteps crossed the floor above them, but they weren't their mother's. They were the heavy, deliberate steps of armed men. They were too late. They had already captured her. "Well, well!" A familiar voice gloated from directly overhead. It was Eli Thompson. "Sounds like our little witnesses decided to come home after all." The trapdoor was ripped open. The barrels of half a dozen rifles pointed down at them. They were trapped, boxed in a tunnel with no way out, their evidence now completely worthless. But as Eli's men started to climb down into the tunnel after them, a new sound filled the air. A sound that started as a distant rumble and grew with impossible speed. The unmistakable thunder of horses, dozens of them approaching at a full gallop. Someone else was coming, and they were riding hard. The thundering hooves belonged to a full company of federal marshals. Silas Ward, before creating his diversion, had used a small pocket mirror to flash a coded signal to a distant hilltop where his backup team had been waiting for the call. Eli Thompson's face went white with shock as he saw them. 20 armed lawmen crested the ridge and surrounded the homestead, their rifles trained on every door and window. His carefully built empire was collapsing in on him in a matter of seconds. "Release the woman and surrender," the lead marshal called out through a speaking trumpet. "You're surrounded and outgunned." But Eli wasn't a man who surrendered. He grabbed Mercy Whitmore, pressing the cold steel of his pistol against her temple. He dragged her into the center of the room, a human shield against the inevitable. "I've got nothing to lose," he screamed back, his voice cracking with desperation. "You back off, or she dies right here." From the tunnel below, Boone and Clayton heard it all. Their mother's life was hanging by a thread. The evidence they held was the only leverage they had left. Clayton made a split-second decision. He pointed down a different branch of the tunnel. "The old well," he mouthed to Boone. It was a desperate gamble, a narrow passage that led to the dry well behind the house. If he could get to the surface, he might be able to get the documents to the marshals. Boone stayed hidden near the cellar entrance, listening as Eli, trapped and cornered, began to rant. The corrupt lawyer confessed to everything, shouting details of his operation, bragging about the judges he'd bribed, the deeds he'd forged, the smuggling routes he controlled. "You federals have no authority here," he yelled. "Sheriff Morrison runs this county, and every judge for 100 miles is in my pocket." But even as he spoke, his own organization was crumbling. One of his men, seeing the hopelessness of the situation, began to quietly sneak toward the back door, ready to surrender. The conspiracy was eating itself alive. Clayton clawed his way out of the dry well just as the sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the valley. He still had the satchel. He crawled on his stomach through the tall grass, inch by agonizing inch, until he reached the federal marshal's line. He pushed the satchel of papers into the lead marshal's hands. The lawman's eyes widened as he quickly scanned the deeds, the maps, the meticulous records of stolen goods. His expression grew darker with every page. "This shows fraud going back 5 years," he muttered to his second-in-command. "Dozens of families. He robbed them all blind." The evidence changed everything. This wasn't a simple standoff anymore. This was the final act of a massive federal investigation into organized crime. The lead marshal raised his trumpet again, his voice now booming with a new authority. "Eli Thompson, you're under federal arrest for land fraud, conspiracy, and a dozen other charges. It's over. Surrender now." Inside the house, Eli saw Clayton. He saw the marshals passing the documents back and forth. He saw the absolute final destruction of his life's work. And he snapped. His desperation turned to pure rage. He shoved Mercy away from him, sending her sprawling to the floor. He raised his pistol, not at the marshals outside, but at the window where Clayton had emerged. He was going to kill the boy who had ruined him. But Silas Ward was ready. The veteran marshal, positioned perfectly, had been waiting for this exact moment. A single shot rang out, clean and final. Eli Thompson dropped to the floor, his criminal empire dying with him. The moment their leader fell, the fight was over. Sheriff Morrison and the remaining men threw down their weapons and surrendered. Federal marshals flooded the house, securing the scene and arresting every last conspirator. Mercy Whitmore scrambled to her feet and ran outside, collapsing as she embraced her two sons climbing out of the tunnel. Tears of terror and relief streamed down her face. "I thought I'd lost you both," she whispered, holding them so tight they could barely breathe. "We found the proof, Mother," Boone said, holding up the last of the papers. "Father's land is worth a fortune, and now everyone knows the truth." In the weeks that followed, the documents the boys found blew the lid off the largest criminal network the territory had ever seen. Arrests were made across 3 territories. Judges, lawmen, and businessmen were all brought to justice. Mercy Whitmore's ownership of her land was restored, along with the mineral and water rights that made her family wealthy overnight. The underground spring transformed their struggling farm into the most prosperous in the region. The dozens of other families who had been cheated by Eli had their land returned or were paid full compensation. The tunnel system was permanently sealed with concrete, but not before federal agents cataloged and returned every last piece of stolen property. Silas Ward received a commendation and, tired of life on the trail, decided to retire. 6 months later, he married Mercy Whitmore, giving the boys the father they had lost. As Boone and Clayton played in the green, flourishing fields that were now rightfully theirs, they often looked back at the towering red buttes of Monument Valley. They remembered that terrifying day they chased their dog into a hidden cave and found a secret that changed everything. Their simple curiosity had unraveled a web of lies and brought justice to an entire region, proving that sometimes the smallest voices are the ones that end up making the biggest difference. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of courage and justice. Your support helps us bring these stories to light. Click the video on your screen now to see another story where ordinary people do extraordinary things. You won't want to miss it.